Section 5, God's Gravity. So far, I've discussed semantic patterns and how we find them in the rose windows of churches, the shapes of star forts, and even the cross-section of our DNA. Our DNA is a super-compacted double helix which has an uncanny resemblance to a magnetic field, which seems to be the glue, if not the spark of life, and magnetism seems to have influenced almost everything we use today, one way or another. I was going to dismiss gravity here, but before I levitate across the room, let's consider what it is. We're told it is the attraction between two objects with mass, although it seems only to have 1/8 of the power it should have. So basically, gravity is like a magnet without a north and south pole, as there seems to be no repulsion that we might find when we bring two like poles of a magnet together. Peter Higgs theorized that there was a mystical field that gave mass to particles and thus kick-started gravity. And since then, he has been responsible for the appearance of a number of large black holes that seem to suck money from all over the world to find his elusive God particle, although it seems that this is a front for some sort of demonic portal project. And I'd just like to draw your attention to the location of CERN's black hole. I came across this totally by accident whilst looking at the coastline of the British Isles. I noticed the coastline of France was two sides of a pentagon. On a subnote, the French refer to France as the hexagon, as the administrative districts tend to be hexagonal, but the border is more pentagonal, with sides of approximately 600 kilometres. But look again, the coastline actually implies a pentagram, and indeed, if we add these extra lines to the pentagon, we can find CERN lies in an interesting point. These internal points are actually quite powerful points within a pentagram, and if we measure a single side of this pentagram, we find that they are 333 kilometres long, taking us to 666 kilometres between the points. Now, I'll let you draw your own conclusions from all that information, but personally, I don't believe in coincidences. But thinking back to our electric universe and the magnetic force that may have been created, it's only a small step to say that if ferrous materials were drawn together magnetically, it wouldn't be long, at least astronomically speaking, before those blobs of magnetic mass would start attracting other non-ferrous material in a gravitational attraction and start forming larger bodies. And moving on, we could easily imagine how this could form a number of interrelated bodies to form a star system. And again, I'm going to jump ahead here and get to the most interesting theory of how our solar system once appeared from Earth's observational point. In the 1960s, David Talbot started looking into ancient religion symbols and found many similarities between symbols from around the world. He also found similarities in the creation stories and mythical catastrophes. He developed a thesis that these symbols had been observed in the skies and the creation stories also had a common origin. He came up with a model that he worked on for around a decade but couldn't reconcile the physics behind it. He had almost given up hope on the idea when, out of the blue, someone who had seen his work contacted him with a working model. The key to solving the problem was magnetism. This is David's idea. There was once a golden age on Earth, when there was no night or day, and this is written about in the Bible too. A time of abundance where nobody needed to toil, and food and life was free and plentiful. This is the Bible's Garden of Eden. God was omnipresent in the sky, looking over his creation and providing for all creation. So, here are a number of symbols that David Talbot found scattered around the world. A documentary on David's presentation in the early 1980s can be found on YouTube under the title of Remembering the End of the World. His book is called The Saturn Myth, and I found a free PDF of this 500-page book online. The basic premise is that Saturn, Venus, Mars and Earth were held in a fixed alignment and far closer to each other than there are today. Jupiter was also in this alignment, but not visible from Earth for most of the time. The alignment was held by magnetism, and Saturn, Venus and Mars would have been visible in the northern skies. I'm going to suggest a number of my own observations and theories that the position in the sky would have been near Cassiopeia, and the width of Saturn in this position would have been approximately 5 times wider than the Moon or the Sun appears in the sky today. Saturn is around 3.5 times more reflective than the Moon, and this means there would have been approximately 43 to 54 times brighter than a full moon appears now, and the northern hemisphere would have effectively been bathed in constant light. Just imagine how fast and how big things would grow if bathed in constant light, no night. Just imagine how much faster and how bigger things would have grown if bathed in constant light. It is said that the ancient Egypt's day started at sunset, when Atum appeared brighter in the sky overhead. So as the sun rose in the sky, Atum would appear to dim. Is this why we have the morning when the sun rises? We're in mourning with the loss of Atum in the sky. It's also interesting that the Jewish Sabbath starts at sunset too, as does the Catholic Church's observation of their Sabbath. Catholic Mass is usually performed from 6 p.m. on a Saturday as well as Sunday morning. So we might say that their day also starts at sunset. The ring of Saturn was seen as the boundary of heaven, sometimes represented by a rope and sometimes a serpent eating its own tail, an eternal ring. Is this why we exchange and wear wedding bands, a symbol of the eternal ring of love, the eternal love of our God, Saturn? As the Earth rotates, the ring would have appeared to rotate in the sky above, illuminated by the sun, appearing as a horseshoe or a crescent, and David suggests that the bull horns and the sun disk is in fact Saturn's ring being illuminated, and the sun disk is in fact the disk of Saturn. This also gives rise to the Muslim symbol, the star within the crescent. So no longer should we view this as an impossible symbol of a star piercing the centre of a crescent moon, but this is Mars or Venus in the centre of, or in front of, Saturn and its rings. Within the boundaries of Saturn's ring was where the heavenly host resided. Saturn God, the Father, Venus, the Holy Mother, and Mars, the Holy Child of the heavens. The Catholic chalice becomes the representation of the crescent ring, and the host is the heavenly host of Saturn. The heavens within the eternal ring were also known as Jerusalem, or of peace, or Memphis. perpetual beauty. The worshippers of Saturn often try to recreate heaven on earth, so we find many references to Jerusalem and Memphis in many areas of the world. So if you find Jerusalem in Edinburgh or Memphis in Egypt, then I'm only surprised that you stopped looking elsewhere, as you should surely find it everywhere. The only place it truly existed was above us. All others are impostors or facsimiles of the heavens above, much like the landscape zodiac being littered liberally around the Albion countryside. And unfortunately, because I was brought up in a Christian country, I must return to my Christian roots and recall the Lord's Prayer as I was taught it. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, for ever and ever. Amen. So, first, we are identifying God, pronouncing his name as most holy, although his name isn't mentioned. We invite him into our world, where we will follow his leadership on earth as the host follow his leadership in the heavens. We praise him for his abundance of life, giving food. We ask for forgiveness for all wrongdoings and ask for the forgiveness of those that wronged us, although the word trespass replaced the word debt from the King James original version. Maybe the Catholic Church don't want us to forgive our debts now, as they enslave us to their debt system of control. Guide us away from sin and protect us from the sinners. Thy kingdom come, which seems to be interpreted by many as they will go to heaven after death, but not according to the Bible, which basically says we will sleep until we are reawoken. So, although we never go to heaven, we will never go to hell either. And why do they offer our prayer to Amun? It's okay. Amun is one of the 42 sun gods adopted after Atum or Satan left his omnipresent position, which I'll talk about shortly. So, if God is our forefather, then surely we can carry him within our DNA. But don't confuse yourself with God. He may live on within you, but you are not God, at least in my opinion. And I recently saw a talk on the tabernacle buried deep in our own brain, which was an extremely interesting interpretation of the Bible as a user manual to the body, and clearly came back to the conclusion that God lives in our brain. And again, we come back to that depiction upon the Sistine Chapel ceiling and the Isle of Man within the heart of the Albion Zodiac. I hope you're keeping track of how many times my research seems to go off on a complete tangent to where I thought I was going, only to find myself right back where I started. But how can Saturn, a planet, be the father to a human? Okay, I'm really going to blow some minds here. For those that came on the open mic night, you will recall my visit to St Agnes in Cornwall and the sleeping giant there. The 600 metres or 1,968 foot tall humanoid. Many have a problem with the size of this giant, as it's far bigger than you have been led to believe could have been possible to exist on this planet. And I'm now going to tell you, this is not the biggest giant we have found. In fact, this guy is as small to the next giant as we are to the 600-metre tall giant. But before I talk about these mind-blowing giants and cause you all to stand up and leave the nutter stood alone here at the front of the room, I want to touch on another subject, like mythology, that you have been taught to dismiss as mumbo-jumbo. Section 6. Astrology. Have you ever wondered why so many people are interested in astrology? I have said that all religion is based upon the worship of the sun and the zodiac, but it used to be the worship of Saturn and the heavenly host, or the planets. So, when and why did we flip from the worship of God Saturn to the worship of Son of God, the one that's reborn on the 25th of December every year? Well, believe it or not, it was after the child of God came to earth, when Saturn's kingdom came to earth. Thy kingdom came and went, and no doubt people thought it was the end of the world. They may have even seen it as God's wrath upon the earth, as an effort to punish the sinners. As part of David Talbot's investigation, he found a number of symbols that some of you will find familiar, like the wheel of heaven, yin and yang. And why did these symbols become religious? And what is their meaning? Well, David points to the sky, and in particular Venus, the Holy Mother, and Mars, the child of God. At some point, the stability of the conjunction of Earth, Mars, Venus, Saturn, and Jupiter became unstable, and Mars, the child of God, also known as the god of war and chaos, started oscillating between Earth and Venus. This caused a transfer of materials between Mars and Venus and between Mars and Earth. These were illuminated and visible from Earth and potentially deposited a large amount of biological and geological material, and would have certainly caused catastrophic changes to the atmosphere, water levels, and life on Earth. And astrology was born. It is the study of planets rather than the study of the stars. If the gods or planets moved and had such a devastating influence on the Earth, then people would be wary of any future planetary movements. And is it just another coincidence that wary is spelt war? Why? To be aware of the god of war, wary. So the science of astrology was created so that the followers of the planet gods would know what the gods' will was for them, often consulting with their high priests, astrologers. In biblical terms, this would seem to be Adam's expulsion from the Garden of Eden, and even a serpent would have been visible in the heavens. David Talbot looked at many other mythical disastrous events that were recorded. David believed Mars's chaotic movements ultimately marked the end of the Golden Age, and the alignment was destroyed. This may have been seen as an abandonment by the gods. With no god looking over us and no longer influencing our world, we appeared to have moved away from the planetary gods to the sun and its zodiacal disciples. But before I move on to the next section, I just want to mention the moon, if for no other reason than it has no motion, and it actually still influences the planet today. And now you're thinking, I'm seeing things and talking twaddle. But think about it. We never see the far side. We always have the same face of the moon. it doesn't rotate from our perspective. Think about that. If it is a giant ball in space, it rotates approximately once every 4 weeks, exactly in time with its orbit around the Earth. However, as the Earth orbits the Sun once a year, the Moon actually orbits the Earth 14 times, once every 25 and a bit days, but passes between us and the Sun every 27 and a bit days, but all the time facing the same direction. If, in fact, we were to observe the Earth from the Moon, it would appear motionless in the sky overhead, although rotating. So not dissimilar to how David has described Saturn, Venus, and Mars in the Golden Age. And it is my belief that the Moon is held in its motionless orbit by magnetism. There really seems no other explanation, but surely, with so much evidence of objects hitting it, it would have moved or given it a little push one way or another and give it some rotation. But there's none. The Moon has always fascinated us, well, me for one, like the fact that it's about 400 times smaller than the Sun, and the Sun is about 400 times further away from us than the Moon, and as such, we have solar and lunar eclipses that are visible from Earth, and you can predict hundreds or even thousands of years in advance. A lunar eclipse to us would appear as a solar eclipse on the Moon, but unlike our solar eclipse, where we only get a few minutes, the Moon would be in totality for several hours at any given point on its surface. Some of you may remember the 2,000-year-old computer or Antikythera mechanism found in a shipwreck off the coast of Greece. It was found in 1901, but not all of its workings were visible until 2008, when X-ray technology was able to penetrate deeper into the mechanism. The device could accurately predict the position of the zodiac, the Sun, and the Moon, and even predict both solar and lunar eclipses, or partial eclipses. And is there any wonder why people think we live in a simulation? So, if we could predict the recent solar eclipse in the USA and that of the 2017 one, along with their path over 2,000 years ago, how hard would it be to influence the names of towns and cities or even companies in its path and put the fear of God into people that it was purely coincidental and a mystical warning of biblical events happening? And how easy would it be to time world events to coincide with predictable natural events, even 2,000 years ago? We really need to consider that the world events are more by design than by happy coincidence. This is mentioned within the first chapter of my first book, when I discovered that the 2020 market crash was predicted by the Dow Jones Industrial Average at least 10 years before it happened. So the exact date and value of the crash was known 10 years prior. So if you still believe in a free market economy, I'm sorry to have to break it to you like this, but it's all a fixed or rigged market. And I'll come back to the economy before I finish. But you surely have to wonder, how could anyone predict a future pandemic 10 years in advance? And if you knew when and how far the market was going to crash, would you have the integrity not to profit from that knowledge? On the flip side, if you warned people, would you be branded a lunatic conspiracy theorist prior to the Black Swan event, or arrested after the event for insider trading, or just continue on and stand for re-election and claim it was pure luck that you outperformed every single hedge fund manager worldwide? Section 7. Tree of Life. Trees seem to be very prominent in conspiracy theories, from the Grand Canyon being the roots, to any number of mountings being an old tree stump. I certainly don't agree with everything being an old wooden tree stump. For example, Devil's Tower looks more like a mushroom than a tree stump. And at 386 metres or 1,267 feet tall, can you imagine the size and the canopy of that mushroom? And mushrooms seem to be an integral part of early religious ceremonies and even the architecture. But how plausible is the tree stump theory? It's actually a very interesting subject, aren't they all? We are told, here we go again, more Khazarian propaganda, that it takes hundreds, if not thousands of years for wood to petrify, yet the evidence suggests that this is more manure than fact. You will probably remember, if you're over the age of 45, Mount St Helens eruptions in 1980. The eruption caused landslides and a large number of trees ended up at the bottom of a lake. Academics and scientists were astonished to find that the mineralization of the trees started almost immediately, and within a year some of the wood was fully petrified. And just whilst we're here, I'd like to show you an amazing bit of what I believe is petrified wood in the wall of the car park of the Norton Arms pub in Runcorn, which is where I go on every Friday at lunchtime. The pub itself is actually a fascinating building for many reasons, but more on that another time. In the car park, ignored by most people, there is the longest piece of, well, I believe it was a wooden lintel over an entrance. And if we look across the road, we'll see an example of what I believe it would have looked like before it was petrified. And I also believe it was petrified in situ. In my first book, and within the second Starfort video that I did, I explored the evidence that our own home in Runcorn showed evidence to support the mud flood theory, and I fully believe that this could be the cause of all the petrified giant tree stumps. But let's just consider the tree of life. This is the Celtic representation of the tree of life, and if you are following everything so far, you might even consider it to be not dissimilar to the magnetic field of a bar magnet. So, are they saying that the magnetic field is the tree of life? It certainly seems to be associated with a great deal of everything we've been looking at today. But here is another representation of the tree of life, and if we consider the roots, isn't this just another toroidal field? Now let's consider the life on this tree. Although we say it is alive, the signs of life are at the edge of the canopy, the leaves. The rest of the tree is mostly just servicing the outer growth. And this then reminded me of something else, another toroidal field, and how all the life seems to be concentrated on its extremities of its vast canopy. So are we indeed living on the canopy of the tree of life that we know and love as Earth? Or, like the Tower of Babel, have the worshippers of the past raised the land to be closer to their God? Or maybe the matter has been flowing in the toroidal field and simply accumulated in the northern hemisphere by accident? Or is there another explanation that I haven't mentioned yet? But plate tectonics or natural geography just isn't going to cut it with me anymore. If you believe we are on a spinning ball, then there should be an even distribution of the land. And if you think it's a flat disk, then something is wrong too. But I'm going to leave this open right now, and I'm simply offering up a number of possible ideas. Section 8. Fractals. Back in the 1980s, fractals were big news as some bright spark realised that the stock market seemed to resemble repeated patterns, and this was a fractal of the long-term movement of the market. No surprise, as I now see this as a totally controlled environment or a giant Ponzi scheme. In real terms, the overall value of the stock market has never recovered from the great crash in 1929, when we consider the value of the US dollar against the price of silver or gold. I said earlier that our DNA was essentially a fractal of our body, although I guess it's really the cell that is the fractal, and the DNA is the instructions for the individual cell and the overall design of our body. This phenomenon is repeated in every form of life, but there are also evidence that it happens on an even larger scale and in some very unexpected places. So let's take a look at some things that I'm referring to as fractals, although you may find my definition slightly off initially, but bear with me here, because if this doesn't blow your mind, then I'll need to start the talk again from the start and make sure you've understood every bit of the jigsaw that got me to this point. So let's start with the zodiac, the subjective constructs we gave to the heavenly disciples. And we see them in Glastonbury, then repeated in the coastline of the British Isles, which in turn seems to be a fractal or miniature version of Europa. And I'm going to have to borrow a flat earth map for the next step, as we now seem to find that the British Isles is in fact a fractal of virtually the entire world. That is to say, the fraction of the current world's land surface seems to represent all of the entire world, which in my mind makes it a fractal. Now let's take a look at a couple of Saturn's moons, which were possibly once visible from Earth with the naked eye. This is Pan and Atlas. They both have a familiar shape to them, a fried egg. Not dissimilar to Saturn and its rings, or maybe the solar system, or even the Milky Way. And who knows what the universe would truly look like from a distance. But I have a feeling we just need to look at those fractals of Pan and Atlas. But is it a fried egg or a giant eye? Remember Atum, the all-seeing eye of God in the sky? Maybe I'm looking at this wrong. Maybe the fractal isn't a fried egg, but an eye and the lens of an eye. And now let's go back to my other talk. Man is 2 meters tall. Then there was the giant skull in St. Agnes, making the humanoid 600 meters tall. That's 300 times larger than us, which really calls into question our geology. How many times have you looked at a hill or a mountain and thought, it looks like a face or an animal? I truly believe that the coastline of St. Agnes is made up of a giant humanoid, at least in part. But what about Ben Nevis? And you have sat here for so long, and I'm almost finished. So don't get up and leave just yet. Hang on for a minute or two. I'm nearly done, honest. So Ben here had his teeth robbed. But if it is a skull, he would have stood around 90 kilometers tall. And he has a twin too, but you'll only see him if you get my second book. So Ben is around 150 times taller than St. Agnes humanoid, which was 600 meters tall, which therefore Ben would have stood some 45,000 times taller than us. But wait, I'll skip Britannia and Europa again, and we'll go for Gaia, Mother Earth. And here we are on the flat Earth map again so you can see her at around 30,000 kilometers tall. Now, I know what you're going to say here, that there is no way that any of these humanoids above the size of Ben Nevis could have lived or grown up on Earth. And I would be inclined right now to agree. But even if our St. Agnes sleeper was the largest, his kind could have built or raised the level of the ground we now live on. So either way, biology or built by giant humanoids, the geology of the world is nothing like what you thought it was, or that we had been told it is. Now, just before I finish, I'd like to go back to the statement I made earlier about human body just before the break. The body is a mobile factory that filters the elements to produce everything it needs to build our bodies. And until we establish the true nature of Ben, or even St. Agnes sleeper, we will never know if it was possible for Earth to sustain large humanoids. However, we can say that we are not the first to have seen and recognized these giants, and their bodies have been mined for thousands of years to recover the body's filtered elements, which includes veins of gold and silver. Why do you think they call them veins? And is coal just the root of a large petrified tree? Section 9. Thank you for hanging around. Just before I finish, I'd like to discuss part of my first chapter of my first book, Cash is King, but what is cash? Unfortunately, it is in fact a worthless token of your enslavement to the tyrannical debt system. You cannot eat or drink it. It is worthless as stock on the stock market or cryptocurrencies. The only value it holds is the value that others give to it. Anyone who values their wealth in terms of fiat currency truly holds no wealth. Our wealth should be measured by our family and friends. Our currency is the time we share with others and the knowledge we retain, utilise and share as well. So if you value my time and knowledge that I have shared with you this evening, I can relieve you of your hard-earned tokens of enslavement and offer more insight to offend your education, religion and thinking in the form of my printed books. The price of these offensive materials will not cover the costs of obtaining the knowledge held within them unless I sell about 100,000 copies. So please buy 10 copies each and to share amongst your friends. Thank you and good night.